Catherine stood at the tall windows of Kensington Palace, watching the morning mist roll across the perfectly manicured gardens. The early sunlight painted everything in golden hues, but her heart felt heavy with uncertainty. 3 months had passed since the coronation, and everything she thought she knew about royal life had changed overnight. She remembered the day when she was just Catherine Middleton, a university student who could walk freely through the streets of St. Andrews, grab coffee with friends without security detail, and make spontaneous decisions about her weekend plans. Those days felt like a distant dream now, especially after the recent changes that had turned her world completely upside down. The sound of footsteps echoed in the marble hallway behind her, and she turned to see her private secretary, Margaret, approaching with that familiar expression of concern mixed with professional duty. Margaret had been with the royal household for over 20 years and had witnessed many transitions, but even she seemed unsettled by the recent developments. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret began carefully, "we need to discuss the new protocols that came into effect this morning." She carried a leather folder that seemed to weigh more than its physical content suggested. Catherine knew that inside that folder were rules that would reshape every aspect of her daily existence. Catherine nodded, though every fiber of her being wanted to resist what was coming. She had known this day would arrive eventually, but she had hoped for more time to adjust to royal life gradually. The sudden implementation of these new restrictions felt like walls closing in around her, limiting freedoms she had taken for granted just yesterday. They walked together to Catherine's private study, a room she had carefully decorated to feel like a sanctuary within the formal palace environment. The walls were lined with books she had collected over the years, photographs of family moments that felt increasingly precious, and small mementos from her life before the crown. Now, even this personal space felt different, touched by the weight of new expectations and limitations. Margaret opened the folder and spread several documents across the mahogany desk. The official letterhead bore the royal seal, and Catherine could see her future written in formal language that seemed to drain the life from everything it touched. Each page represented another aspect of her independence that was being carefully regulated and controlled. "The first major change," Margaret explained gently, "concerns your freedom of movement. From today forward, you cannot travel anywhere without prior approval from the Palace Security Council. This includes visits to your family, shopping trips, and even walks in the palace gardens." Catherine's hand instinctively moved to her phone, thinking of all the times she had simply decided to visit her sister Pippa or her parents without needing permission from anyone. The weight of this restriction hit her immediately. She thought about last week, when she had spontaneously driven to her childhood home in Bucklebury to surprise her mother on her birthday. That kind of genuine, heartfelt gesture was now impossible. Every visit would need to be planned weeks in advance, with security sweeps and official protocols that would strip away any sense of natural family connection. Catherine looked out the window again, this time seeing the gardens not as a peaceful retreat, but as the boundaries of her new, more limited world. The iron gates that had once represented protection now felt like barriers keeping her separated from the life she had known and loved. "There's more," Margaret continued, her voice growing softer. "Your social media presence must be completely managed by the communications team. Personal posts, family photos, messages to friends. Everything must be approved before publication." Catherine's heart sank as she realized that her Instagram account, where she had shared glimpses of her life and connected with friends, would no longer be her own voice. She remembered the joy she had felt just last month when she posted a candid photo of herself baking with the children, flower in her hair, and genuine laughter captured in that moment. Those authentic connections with the public, the ability to show her real personality, were now subject to committee approval and strategic messaging considerations. The irony wasn't lost on her that in becoming more royal, she was becoming less human in the eyes of those who followed her journey. The public had fallen in love with her precisely because she seemed accessible and genuine, Yet these new rules would create artificial distance between her and the very people who had embraced her so warmly. Margaret turned another page, and Catherine saw a section titled Personal Relationships and Communications. Her stomach tightened as she realized this would affect her friendships, some of which dated back to her university days and had sustained her through every major life transition. All personal correspondence must be reviewed, Margaret explained. Text messages, emails, phone calls, they all need to go through official channels. Your friends will need security clearance to maintain contact, and casual conversations are discouraged. Catherine thought about Jessica, her roommate from university who had been her confidant through everything, and wondered how their easy, spontaneous friendship could survive such formal barriers. The rule about phone calls particularly stung because Catherine had always been someone who preferred intimate conversations to formal meetings. Some of her most meaningful connections had happened during long, rambling phone calls where she could truly be herself. Now, knowing that every word might be monitored and analyzed, how could she maintain the authenticity that made those relationships special? She walked to her desk and picked up a framed photo from her wedding day, showing her laughing with her university friends who had supported her through the intense media scrutiny of her early relationship with William. These women had kept her grounded and reminded her of who she was beyond the titles and expectations. Now, their continued friendship would depend on their willingness to submit to background checks and formal protocols. Catherine set the photo down and turned back to Margaret, who was watching her with sympathy, but also professional detachment. Margaret had seen other royals struggle with these transitions, and she knew that adaptation was not optional. It was survival. The fashion protocols have also been updated, Margaret continued, opening to another section. Your wardrobe choices must reflect royal dignity at all times. Casual clothing is permitted only in completely private settings within the palace. Public appearances, even informal ones, require formal attire approved by the style committee. Catherine thought about her favorite pair of jeans, worn and comfortable, perfect for playing with the children or gardening. She thought about the simple sundresses she loved for summer afternoons and the cozy sweaters that made her feel like herself on quiet evenings. All of these comfort items were now relegated to a very small portion of her life. The restriction felt particularly painful because Catherine had always believed that authentic style was about feeling comfortable and confident in what you wore. Some of her most beloved public moments had happened when she wore something that reflected her personality rather than royal expectations. Now, every outfit would be a carefully calculated statement rather than a natural expression of who she was. Margaret showed her a chart outlining appropriate attire for different types of events, with specific colors, hemlines, and accessories dictated for each occasion. The spontaneity and personal choice that had always been part of getting dressed were being replaced by a uniform-like approach that prioritized symbolism over comfort or individual expression. Even your hair and makeup have guidelines now, Margaret added quietly. Styles must be conservative and traditional. Bold colors or trendy cuts are not permitted. Catherine unconsciously touched her hair, thinking about how she had always enjoyed experimenting with different looks and how her hairstylist had become a trusted friend over the years. The final section of the folder dealt with her charitable work and public speaking, areas where Catherine had felt most confident and purposeful as a royal. Your causes and patronages will be selected by the Royal Foundation Board, Margaret explained. Personal passion projects that haven't been officially approved must be discontinued. Catherine's heart broke a little as she thought about the small charity she had quietly supported for years, an organization that helped young mothers in difficult situations. She had discovered them through personal research and had felt deeply connected to their mission. The work wasn't glamorous or high-profile, but it had given her a sense of purpose and genuine contribution to society. Now, her charitable work would be chosen based on strategic considerations rather than personal passion. The authentic commitment that had driven her most meaningful work would be replaced by assigned duties that might feel hollow and performative. As Margaret gathered the documents, Catherine realized that what was being taken away wasn't just freedom. It was the ability to be spontaneous, genuine, and human. The rules were designed to protect the monarchy and maintain dignity, but they also created a barrier between who she was inside and who she could be in the world. Standing alone in her study after Margaret left, Catherine looked around at the personal touches that suddenly felt like museum pieces from her former life. Tomorrow, she would begin living under these new restrictions, and she wondered if the person she had been, the woman who had captured William's heart and the public's affection, would survive this transformation. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, and Catherine made a silent promise to herself that somehow, despite everything that was changing, she would find a way to remain true to the core of who she was. The rules might control her actions, but they couldn't touch her heart or her determination to make a meaningful difference in the world, even within these new constraints. 3 weeks into the new restrictions, Catherine sat in the formal drawing room of Kensington Palace, staring at her daily schedule that had been planned down to 15-minute intervals. Every moment of her day was now accounted for, approved, and supervised. The spontaneity that had once brought joy to her life had been completely eliminated, replaced by a rigid structure that felt suffocating. Her morning had begun at 6 o'clock with a security briefing about her approved activities for the day. Even her breakfast choices had been pre-selected by nutritionists and approved by the household staff. The simple pleasure of deciding whether she wanted coffee or tea, toast or cereal, had been taken away and replaced by a meal plan designed to project the right image of royal health and propriety. William found her there, looking out the window with an expression that had become increasingly common since the new rules took effect. He sat beside her, and she could see in his eyes that he understood her struggle, even though he had been born into this life and had never known the freedom she was mourning. "I called my mother yesterday," Catherine said quietly, "and I had to do it from the communications office with someone listening to every word. I couldn't tell her about the children's funny moments or complain about my headache or just be a daughter talking to her mom." Her voice carried a weight of sadness that made William's heart ache for the woman he had fallen in love with, someone who had brought such natural warmth and authenticity to the royal family. William reached for her hand, knowing that his touch was one of the few genuine connections she could still experience without official oversight. "I've been trying to speak with grandmother about some modifications," he said, though they both knew that tradition and protocol were not easily changed, especially not for personal comfort. Catherine appreciated his efforts, but she had begun to understand that these restrictions weren't just arbitrary rules. They were part of a system that had evolved over centuries to protect the monarchy from scandal, criticism, and human error. Her personal happiness was not a priority in that equation, and fighting against it might only make things worse. Her phone buzzed with a text message, but she knew better than to look at it immediately. All messages now went through a screening process, and she would receive a summary of approved communications later in the day. The device that had once been her connection to friends, family, and the world had become just another reminder of how controlled her life had become. She thought about her friend Sarah, who had texted her regularly since university with funny observations about daily life, pictures of her children, and invitations to casual get-togethers. Sarah's last few messages had gone unanswered because they contained references to current events and personal opinions that the communications team deemed inappropriate for royal correspondence. Catherine missed those conversations desperately. The easy back and forth of friendship, the ability to share honest thoughts about everything from television shows to parenting challenges. Now, her responses had to be carefully crafted to avoid controversy, maintain neutrality, and protect royal reputation. The authentic voice that had made her friendships meaningful was being slowly erased. That afternoon, Catherine attended a charity event that had been scheduled months in advance. She wore a navy blue dress that had been selected by the style committee, carried a handbag that matched royal protocol, and smiled at precisely the right moments as outlined in her briefing materials. Everything about her appearance and behavior was perfect according to royal standards. But as she moved through the event, shaking hands and making polite conversation, Catherine felt like she was watching herself from outside her body. The woman at this event looked like her and sounded like her, but the spontaneous warmth and genuine curiosity that had once defined her interactions with people were being suppressed by the need to stay within approved boundaries. During a break in the event, she met a young mother who had benefited from the charity services. The woman began sharing her story with such honesty and emotion that Catherine's natural instinct was to respond with equal openness and personal connection. But she caught herself before saying anything that hadn't been pre-approved and instead offered the polite, safe response that had been outlined in her briefing. Walking away from that conversation, Catherine felt heartbroken. The young mother had needed someone to truly hear her story and respond with authentic empathy. Instead, she had received a royal performance that, while polite and appropriate, had missed the opportunity for genuine human connection that could have meant so much to both of them. Back at the palace that evening, Catherine sat in her private quarters and pulled out a journal she had been keeping since the restrictions began. Writing had become her only outlet for authentic expression, the one place where she could be completely honest about her thoughts and feelings without committee approval or strategic consideration. She wrote about the event that day, about the missed opportunity for real connection, about the growing distance she felt between who she was inside and who she was required to be in public. The journal had become a repository for the real Catherine, the one who missed her freedom, questioned some royal traditions, and sometimes felt overwhelmed by the weight of expectations. As she wrote, Catherine realized that she was documenting the slow disappearance of her former self. Each day, under the new restrictions, a little more of her spontaneity, authenticity, and personal agency was being trained out of her. She was becoming an expertly crafted royal persona, but at the cost of her humanity. Her children knocked on her door, wanting to show her something they had created in their art class. As they burst into her room with excitement and creative pride, Catherine felt a moment of pure joy watching their uninhibited enthusiasm. But even this precious family time was affected by the new restrictions. Their activities had to be approved, their playmates screened, and their innocent questions about why Mommy couldn't do certain things anymore answered carefully. The children had noticed changes in her routine and behavior, asking why they couldn't spontaneously visit grandparents anymore or why Mommy's phone calls were always in the office instead of in the garden where they used to play together. Catherine struggled to explain restrictions that she herself was still processing, trying to protect their sense of normalcy while adapting to a reality that felt anything but normal. That night, as she tucked them into bed, her youngest child asked why she seemed sad lately. Catherine's heart broke as she realized that her struggle with the new restrictions was affecting not just her own happiness, but her children's security and sense of family warmth. She was becoming a more distant, controlled version of herself, even in the privacy of their family moments. After the children were asleep, Catherine found herself in the palace library, surrounded by biographies of previous royal family members. She read stories of others who had faced similar restrictions and wondered how they had maintained their sense of self while fulfilling their royal duties. Some had seemed to thrive within the structure, while others had clearly struggled with the loss of personal freedom. She found a memoir written by a duchess from the previous generation who had described the emotional toll of constantly representing the crown rather than expressing personal opinions or feelings. The woman had written about feeling like an actress playing a role 24 hours a day, never allowed to fully relax into authentic self-expression. Reading those words, Catherine felt less alone in her struggle, but also more worried about her future. If women who had been raised in aristocratic families struggled with these restrictions, how could someone like her, who had grown up with middle-class values of independence and authenticity, successfully adapt to this level of control? She closed the book and walked to the window, looking out at the London skyline beyond the palace grounds. Somewhere in that city were her university friends, living lives where they could speak freely, travel spontaneously, dress according to their moods, and express their personalities without committee approval. The distance between their lives and hers had never felt greater. Catherine made a decision that night that would influence how she approached the months ahead. Rather than continuing to fight against the restrictions or simply accepting them with resignation, she would try to find ways to maintain her authentic self within the boundaries that had been set for her. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be the same as her former freedom, but perhaps it was possible to be both genuinely herself and genuinely royal. She began to think about small ways she could preserve her authenticity. Through the words she chose within approved responses, through the genuine warmth she could still convey in her expressions and body language, through the private moments with family where she could still be completely herself. The restrictions controlled her actions and words, but they couldn't control the intention and love behind them. As she prepared for bed, Catherine felt the first glimmer of hope she had experienced since the new rules began. Tomorrow would bring another day of scheduled activities and approved interactions, but it would also bring opportunities to find genuine connection within those constraints. She was still learning who she could be within these limitations, and perhaps that discovery process would lead to a version of herself that was both authentic and royal. The path ahead remained uncertain and challenging, but Catherine was beginning to believe that she could walk it without losing the essential parts of herself that had made her the person William loved and the public embraced. The rules had changed what she could do, but they hadn't changed who she was at her core. 2 months had passed since Catherine had made her private resolution to find authenticity within the royal constraints, and the morning brought an unexpected challenge that would test every adaptation she had made. Margaret arrived earlier than usual, her face showing the kind of controlled concern that indicated serious developments. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret began, settling into the chair across from Catherine's desk, "we've received information about a situation that requires immediate attention. There are photographs circulating that show you breaking protocol during last week's charity visit." Catherine's stomach dropped as she remembered the moment Margaret was referring to, when she had instinctively knelt down to comfort a crying child who had been overwhelmed by the crowd. The little girl, no more than 5 years old, had been brought to meet Catherine by her grandmother. When the child became frightened by the cameras and formal atmosphere, Catherine's maternal instincts had overridden her protocol training. Without thinking about proper posture, appropriate distance, or security concerns, she had lowered herself to the child's level and spoken to her in the gentle, natural way she would comfort her own children. In that moment, Catherine had felt a surge of the authentic connection she had been missing so desperately. The child's tears had stopped, replaced by a shy smile that reminded Catherine why she had originally been drawn to charitable work with children. For just a few minutes, she had been herself again rather than a carefully managed royal persona. "The photographs show you kneeling on the ground, which the protocol office says compromises royal dignity," Margaret continued. "There's also concern about the informal way you interacted with the child. The guidelines specify that physical contact should be limited to handshakes, and emotional displays should be controlled." Catherine felt her heart sink as she realized that her most genuine, compassionate moment in weeks was being criticized as a failure. The irony was devastating. The public and media had praised her warmth and relatability in those photographs, calling her interaction with the child beautifully human and exactly what the royal family needed. Social media had been flooded with positive comments about her natural maternal instincts and authentic compassion. But within the palace walls, those same qualities were being labeled as protocol violations. Catherine looked at Margaret, trying to process how something that felt so right could be considered so wrong. "I was comforting a frightened child," she said quietly. "How could that be inappropriate?" But even as she asked the question, she knew the answer. The new restrictions weren't about right and wrong in human terms. They were about maintaining specific standards of royal behavior that prioritized image control over natural response. Margaret's expression softened slightly. "I understand your motivation, your royal highness, and personally, I thought your response was beautiful. But the concern is about precedent. If you break protocol for one touching moment, it becomes difficult to maintain standards in other situations." Catherine began to understand that her individual moments of authenticity were being viewed as threats to the entire system of royal behavior management. The conversation was interrupted by a call from the communications office. The palace was receiving hundreds of requests for interviews about Catherine's refreshing humanity at the charity event. Talk shows wanted her to discuss her parenting philosophy. Magazines wanted features about her approach to royal motherhood, and child welfare organizations were requesting her patronage based on the genuine compassion they had witnessed. Catherine felt torn between pride and panic. The public response proved that her authentic self was exactly what people connected with and appreciated about her role in the royal family. But the internal criticism suggested that being herself was incompatible with the expectations of her position. She was being pulled in opposite directions, toward the humanity that made her effective and beloved, and toward the controlled perfection that satisfied royal protocol. Later that day, Catherine had a private meeting with Queen Elizabeth, who had requested to discuss the recent incidents and overall adjustment to royal life. Catherine entered the Queen's private study feeling nervous, but also hopeful that someone with decades of experience might offer wisdom about balancing authenticity with royal expectations. The Queen, elegant and composed as always, gestured for Catherine to sit in the informal seating area rather than across the formal desk. This small gesture felt significant, suggesting a personal rather than official conversation was about to take place. "I've seen the photographs from your charity visit," the Queen began, and Catherine braced herself for criticism. "The little girl you comforted, her name is Emma, and her grandmother wrote to thank you for your kindness. She said Emma has been talking about the nice princess who knelt down to talk to me every day since." Catherine felt unexpected tears forming as she realized that her authentic moment had created a lasting positive memory for a child. The Queen continued, "In my early years, I faced similar challenges about balancing personal instincts with royal expectations. The difference is that I was born into this life and trained from childhood to suppress natural responses in favor of protocol. You came to us as an adult with fully formed instincts for human connection, and we're asking you to unlearn what makes you most effective." Catherine felt a wave of relief at being understood, but also confusion about what this meant for her future behavior. "Your Majesty, I want to respect protocol, but I also want to be effective in my role. That little girl needed comfort, and I couldn't pretend not to see her distress." The Queen nodded thoughtfully, and Catherine sensed that this conversation might be leading somewhere unexpected. "There are times when protocol serves us well," the Queen explained, "and times when humanity serves us better. The skill lies in recognizing the difference and being prepared for the consequences of choosing humanity over protocol." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "I'm going to speak with the protocol office about creating some flexibility for interactions involving children and vulnerable individuals." Catherine felt hope rising in her chest, but the Queen's next words tempered that optimism. "However, this flexibility will come with increased scrutiny in other areas. If we allow spontaneous compassion in some situations, we must be even more careful about maintaining standards in formal ceremonies, diplomatic events, and public speeches. The balance must be maintained somehow." The conversation marked a turning point in Catherine's understanding of her role. Rather than seeing the restrictions as purely punitive, she began to recognize them as part of a complex system that protected both the monarchy and the public's faith in royal institutions. Her challenge was to find ways to be genuinely helpful and connected while respecting the larger purpose that protocol served. Over the following weeks, Catherine worked with Margaret and the protocol office to identify specific situations where natural human response would be permitted and even encouraged. Children's events, visits to hospitals, and interactions with grieving families were designated as times when authentic emotional connection took priority over formal behavior standards. But this flexibility came with the promised increased restrictions in other areas. Catherine's wardrobe choices became even more limited. Her public statements required additional layers of approval, and her social media presence became virtually non-existent as the communications team struggled to craft messages that felt authentic while meeting all the new requirements for formal communication. The trade-off felt both liberating and limiting. Catherine could comfort crying children and respond naturally to human pain and joy, but she lost even more of her ability to express personal opinions, share family moments, or maintain the casual friendships that had sustained her through previous challenges. Every gain in one area seemed to require a sacrifice in another. During a visit to a hospital pediatric ward, Catherine experienced the positive side of this new balance. When she encountered a young boy who was scared about an upcoming surgery, she was able to sit with him, hold his hand, and share encouraging words without worrying about protocol violations. The genuine connection she made with him and his family felt like the most important work she had ever done as a royal. But that same week, she had to decline a longtime friend's invitation to a casual birthday celebration because the guest list hadn't been security screened and the informal nature of the event didn't meet the requirements for royal social engagements. The contrast between being able to comfort strangers' children while being unable to celebrate with people who had known her since before she was royal highlighted the complexity of her new existence. Catherine began keeping two separate journals during this period. One documented her official royal duties, noting successful events and areas for improvement in her public role. The other remained a private space for processing the emotional cost of constantly adapting her natural responses to fit royal expectations. In her private journal, she wrote about missing the simplicity of friendship without agenda, the freedom to make mistakes without public consequence, and the ability to express frustration or joy without calculating the impact on royal reputation. These losses felt significant and permanent, not just temporary adjustments to a new lifestyle. But she also wrote about the profound satisfaction of making a real difference in people's lives, the privilege of platform she now had to highlight important causes, and the growing understanding that her role, despite its restrictions, offered unique opportunities to create positive change in the world. The weight of responsibility was balanced by the weight of possibility. As autumn arrived at the palace, Catherine stood again at the windows where she had first learned about the new restrictions. The view hadn't changed, but her relationship with the boundaries of her life had evolved. She still missed her former freedom, but she had begun to find purpose and even joy within the constraints that had initially felt overwhelming. The woman looking out the window was different from the one who had stood there months earlier. She was more cautious, but also more intentional, less spontaneous, but more strategic about when and how to let her authentic self emerge. The restrictions had changed her, but they hadn't destroyed the essential qualities that had made her beloved by the public and cherished by her family. A full year had passed since the implementation of the new royal restrictions, and Catherine found herself preparing for one of the most significant events of her royal career. A solo international tour that would test everything she had learned about balancing authenticity with protocol. As she reviewed the detailed itinerary that Margaret had prepared, she reflected on how much her understanding of her role had evolved. The tour would take her to 3 countries over 2 weeks, with each day scheduled to the minute and every interaction carefully planned. A year ago, the thought of such intensive management would have felt suffocating. Now, Catherine recognized it as necessary preparation that would allow her to be most effective in representing the crown while still finding opportunities for genuine human connection. Her first stop was a children's hospital in Romania, where she would meet with young patients and their families. The protocol team had prepared extensive briefings about appropriate behavior, but they had also built in time for the kind of spontaneous interactions that Catherine had learned were often the most meaningful. She felt nervous, but also excited about the opportunity to use her platform for something genuinely helpful. Standing in her dressing room as her stylist prepared the carefully selected outfit for the hospital visit, Catherine caught sight of herself in the mirror and saw someone she was still learning to recognize. The woman looking back at her carried herself with royal composure, but her eyes held the warmth and determination that had always defined her character. The external changes were obvious, but her core self remained intact beneath the polished surface. The flight to Romania gave Catherine time to review the briefing materials about each family she would meet. Unlike her early royal engagements, where she had worried primarily about making protocol mistakes, she now found herself studying the personal details that would help her make meaningful connections with people facing difficult circumstances. Her focus had shifted from protecting herself to serving others effectively. Her first morning at the hospital exceeded every expectation she had developed about what was possible within royal restrictions. When she met 7-year-old Maria, who was recovering from heart surgery, Catherine was able to sit on the bed beside her and listen to stories about her drawings with genuine interest and emotional presence. The protocol officers stood back and allowed the natural interaction to unfold without interference. Maria's mother began crying as she described the fear and uncertainty her family had experienced during the surgery. Catherine took the woman's hands and spoke from her heart about the love that gives parents strength during their children's medical crises. The conversation wasn't scripted or approved, but it emerged from the authentic compassion that Catherine had fought so hard to preserve within her role. Later, as they walked through the hospital corridors, Margaret quietly pointed out that Catherine's natural interactions were creating exactly the kind of positive international coverage that the Royal Communications team hoped to achieve. The authenticity that Catherine had worried might conflict with royal effectiveness was actually enhancing her impact as a representative of the crown. The next part of her tour took her to a rural village where she would visit a school that had received funding from a charity under royal patronage. As their car wound through the countryside, Catherine felt a familiar mix of anticipation and anxiety about meeting new people while representing the monarchy appropriately. The village school was filled with children who had never met anyone from the royal family, and their excitement was infectious. Catherine found herself laughing genuinely at their enthusiastic questions and unexpected observations about royal life. One 10-year-old boy asked if she missed being able to eat ice cream whenever she wanted, a question that was both innocent and surprisingly perceptive about the constraints of royal existence. Catherine's response, that she still loved ice cream, but had to save it for special occasions, was truthful, relatable, and completely appropriate. She realized that honesty about the realities of royal life, when shared with warmth and humor, could actually strengthen public connection rather than diminish royal mystique. The children's teacher later said the visit had inspired several students to research British history and culture. That evening, Catherine attended a formal state dinner where every aspect of her behavior was governed by centuries of diplomatic protocol. She wore a tiara that had been worn by generations of royal women, spoke only when addressed by specific dignitaries, and maintained the controlled composure that formal occasions required. The contrast with her morning at the hospital was stark, but Catherine had learned to move fluidly between different modes of royal behavior. During the dinner, she was seated next to the Romanian Minister of Education, who mentioned his interest in early childhood development programs. Catherine was able to engage knowledgeably about research she had studied and initiatives she had observed, contributing substantively to a conversation that could influence policy affecting thousands of children. This was royal duty at its most meaningful, using her position to advance important causes through informed diplomatic engagement. The dinner conversation reminded Catherine of why the restrictions on her casual social interactions existed. Every word she spoke as a royal carried weight and potential consequence far beyond personal conversation. The training in careful communication that had initially felt limiting was actually preparation for moments when her words could make a real difference in policy and international relationships. Her final stop was a women's shelter in the capital city, where she would meet with survivors of domestic violence and the staff members who supported them. This was the kind of engagement that Catherine found both deeply meaningful and emotionally challenging, requiring her to be fully present with people experiencing profound pain while maintaining the strength and composure that her role demanded. The women she met at the shelter told stories of courage and survival that left Catherine feeling honored to witness their strength. She listened without judgment, offered words of encouragement that came from genuine admiration for their bravery, and learned about the practical challenges they faced in rebuilding their lives. The conversations were intense and real in ways that formal royal engagements rarely allowed. One young mother, barely out of her teens, described her decision to leave an abusive relationship to protect her infant daughter. As she spoke, Catherine felt the full weight of her privilege and responsibility. The security and resources she enjoyed contrasted sharply with the vulnerability and courage of the women she was meeting. The encounter deepened her commitment to using her platform effectively for vulnerable populations. Back in her hotel room that night, Catherine wrote in her private journal about the day's experiences. She described the profound satisfaction of connecting with people facing real challenges and the growing understanding that her restrictions, properly understood, were tools that enhanced rather than limited her ability to serve meaningfully. The structure that had once felt confining had become the framework within which she could work most effectively. The shelter visit had also highlighted how much she had grown in her ability to maintain emotional stability while engaging with difficult situations. Early in her royal career, such intense encounters with human suffering would have left her feeling overwhelmed and uncertain about appropriate responses. Now, she could offer genuine compassion while maintaining the composure that allowed her to be helpful rather than merely sympathetic. Her flight home to London provided time for reflection on how profoundly her relationship with royal restrictions had changed. What had begun as rules imposed upon her had evolved into tools she actively used to maximize her effectiveness and impact. The protocols that had initially felt like barriers to authenticity had become the structure within which she could express her truest values most powerfully. William met her at the airport, and as they drove back to Kensington Palace, Catherine shared stories from her tour with the enthusiasm of someone who had found genuine purpose in her work. She told him about Maria's drawings, the village children's questions about ice cream, the policy discussion at the state dinner, and the courage of the women at the shelter. Each experience had been shaped by royal protocol, but none had been diminished by it. That night, as she tucked her children into bed, they asked about her trip and the people she had met. Catherine found herself able to share age-appropriate versions of her experiences that conveyed both the privileges and responsibilities of royal life. Her children were learning that being royal meant using advantages to help others, a lesson that would shape their understanding of their own futures. Standing once again at the windows of Kensington Palace, Catherine looked out at the same gardens where she had first confronted the reality of royal restrictions. The view remained unchanged, but she now understood that the boundaries of her life were not limitations but definitions of purpose. Within those boundaries, she had discovered a version of herself that was both authentically human and effectively royal. The woman who had once mourned the loss of spontaneous freedom had become someone who found deep satisfaction in purposeful service. The restrictions that had threatened to diminish her humanity had instead focused it toward meaningful impact. She was still Catherine, still warm, still compassionate, still determined to make a difference. But she had learned to channel those qualities through the unique platform and responsibilities that came with her royal role. As she prepared for bed, Catherine felt grateful for the journey that had brought her to this understanding. The transformation had been difficult and sometimes painful, but it had led to a way of life that honored both her authentic self and her royal obligations. She had found a way to be genuinely herself within genuinely royal constraints, and in that balance, she had discovered a form of freedom that was deeper and more meaningful than what she had lost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, all shaped by the protocols and restrictions that had once felt so overwhelming. But Catherine now approached those boundaries not as barriers to overcome, but as tools to use effectively in service of something larger than herself. The rules had changed what she could do, but they had also revealed who she could become.